This video is going to cover the cardiovascular system mostly, and then very briefly we're going to go over the respiratory system. So let's jump in. These are the key terms that you should be familiar with after we go through all of this. So we're starting out by talking about the cardiovascular system. So the function of this system is to transport oxygen, nutrients, any waste chemicals, hormones, and other things like that all over our body from one cell to the other. You may have heard this called the circulatory system in the past. It's the same thing. So what this mainly does is send oxygen-rich blood to the body, to all of our cells, then takes that blood that has had the oxygen removed and takes it back to the lungs to get more energy and to offload carbon dioxide. So this system includes the heart, all of our blood vessels, and our blood. And these images here on the left and the right, these are plasticized examples of cardiovascular systems in humans and in rabbits. Or in a rabbit, excuse me. So these are actual bodies where their veins and their arteries and their heart have undergone this plasticization. Basically, it was plasticized and then removed from the body itself, and you can see the path that every single vein and artery took through their body. The main organ of this system is, of course, the heart. It's a hollow organ, it is very muscular, and usually it's about the size of your fist. So your heart will, it's not the same size for every human. It adjusts its size based on how big you are. And it's located in an area of your chest called the mediastinum. It's mainly composed of cardiac muscle, and it has some connective tissue to hold it all together. Now we call the very bottom right here the apex of the heart, and that usually points towards your left foot. That's why when we say the Pledge of Allegiance in the United States, we put our hands, we're told, over the left side of our chest, and that's where our heart is. No, the heart's right in the center, but the bottom points towards that left foot. So your heart will beat very rhythmically, and for the average person, it's around 60 to 80 times a minute. If it's lower than 60, it usually means you have really good cardiovascular health, you're in very good shape. Anything over 80, and maybe you're a little out of shape, that's usually what those numbers mean. Now, just a fun fact, but your heart every single year pumps enough blood through your body that it could fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So that has to be some incredibly strong muscle there. Now, surrounding your heart is what we call the pericardium. It's a very thick tissue. It's a double layer outer covering that just, its job is to protect the heart. And in between the two layers is something called pericardial fluid. So this fluid allows the layers to pass over each other back and forth without creating friction and wearing down those cells. Because if we think about what's going on in our chest, your heart is constantly pumping. That's a rhythmic motion of the heart itself. Then you're breathing. That's rhythmic motion of your lungs around your heart. You're constantly moving and twisting. If the heart was unprotected, all of those movements would cause the structures in your chest, the bones, the lungs, all of that, to rub against the heart and cause problems and destroy the tissue there. So we want to protect the heart by having these special layers. And you'll find that all of our organs have this type of protective covering for this very same idea. When we look at the anatomy of the heart muscle wall, we see that there's 3 layers. The first one is the epicardium. Now, this is the outer layer of the heart, but the most inside layer of the pericardium. So you know how I said that covering the pericardium has 2 layers? Well, the inner layer, we call that the epicardium. It directly touches the surface and is the surface of your heart. Sometimes it's also called the visceral pericardium. That term visceral, it just means organ. So we're talking about an internal organ. Then myocardium, We break this word down. This term myo means muscle. So this is the actual muscle portion of the heart. So it's cardiac muscle arranged in these ring-like structures, and they are constantly beating. And then the very inner layer is something we call the endocardium. This is a thin layer of a tissue that we call endothelium, and it lines all of your heart's chambers, it lines all of your arteries, all of your veins, and it just helps the blood run more smoothly through all of these structures so it doesn't get caught and start creating clots anywhere. The heart itself, since it is hollow, is separated into 4 different chambers. Now, evolutionarily, the heart has evolved to start with fewer and fewer chambers. So when the first heart really developed, it was more just a circulatory system without a main heart. But then as it started to develop more and more, you had 1 chamber, then 2, then 3, and humans just evolved a 4-chamber heart along with many other mammals. The top 2 are called the atria. A single one is called an atrium, and these are the smaller of the 4 chambers of the heart, and they receive blood from the body or the lungs. So this is kind of the receiving room. Kind of think of it as the foyer of your house. So the right atrium is going to receive blood that does not have as much oxygen anymore. The oxygen has been taken out of it, and it receives that from the body. So from all the tissues that took up all that oxygen, basically. The left atrium receives fully oxygenated blood because it comes directly from the lungs. So right, no oxygen comes from the body. Left, with oxygen, comes from the lungs. The ventricles are the bottom 2 chambers. And if you notice, the atria are let's get a brighter color here. They have very thin walls, whereas the ventricles have incredibly thick muscular walls. That's because these are the portions of the heart that are going to have to do the heavy lifting of pushing that blood through your body. So these have to really squeeze your heart and shove all that blood out into your vessels. So each ventricle is separated by what we call the septum, and this is just a really thick central muscle wall that keeps the blood between the 2 chambers separated. Your right ventricle is going to take deoxygenated blood from the right atrium. So blood comes in to the right atrium, then empties into the right ventricle. From here, it's going to push the blood out. Let me get a different color. Push the blood out towards the lungs. There it's going to pick up all the oxygen that it needs. Then it's going to come back in to the left atrium right here. And the left atrium receives that oxygenated blood from the heart, and then it allows it to come back down into the left ventricle, so it receives all that oxygenated blood from the left atrium, and from the left ventricle out, it's going to get pushed out to the rest of the body. So we go right atrium, right ventricle, lungs, left atrium, left ventricle, body. That's the way that the blood. Now within our heart, we have 4 valves. These are basically stopping points that separate each of our chambers, and they separate the heart from all the other vessels in your body. Basically, it closes off the heart and each section of the heart from everything else. And that is very crucial, because if we didn't have the septum and all of these valves, then the blood inside our heart could mix, and that would mix the deoxygenated and the oxygenated blood and really just defeat the purpose of separating them at all. Now, we also want to be able to control how we send the blood out. And if it's open to the atria, if the ventricles are open to the atria and those are open to the veins, and we try to push blood out, it's just going to flow in any direction. And we don't want that. We want the blood to flow in one direction and keep it going from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart, out to the body, and keep following that path. So we have the semilunar valves. These ones block the blood from going back into the lungs or out to the body until the right time. And then we have the atrioventricular or AV valves. You might have heard these called the bicuspid or the mitral valve or the tricuspid valve. These ones are going to separate the atrium from the ventricle. Then surrounding the heart, there are these arteries that we call coronary arteries. These are the arteries that feed blood to the heart itself. So you think, well, wait a minute, didn't we just fill the heart with blood? Yes, but that blood is not available for the heart to use to feed itself, to get oxygen and to get nutrients and to dispose of waste. So these arteries are the ones that then take blood that's been pushed out back to the body and feed it to the heart itself. So this is how the heart gets its oxygen, how it gets its nutrients, and how it disposes of waste. Then once it does that and uses up all the oxygen and needs to give back the CO2, the cardiac veins are going to take that deoxygenated blood away from the heart and to the lungs to pick up more water. Or more oxygen, excuse me. So we've talked about the heart. Now let's talk about all the vessels that the heart pushes the blood out into. And there's three major types of vessels. We group them into arteries, veins, and capillaries. So arteries just carry the blood away from the heart, veins carry it toward the heart, and the capillaries are kind of the connecting portion that really focus on getting the blood to the cells and then back into the circulatory system. And the capillaries are really tiny. You can see an example image right here where you can see an individual red blood cell. This thing right here is an individual red blood cell inside a capillary. So they're incredibly tiny. So let's go a little bit more in depth into each of these groups. We have arteries first. The largest in diameter, we just call them arteries. But as you get further and further away from the heart, they're going to get smaller and smaller. And at some point, we start calling them arterioles. That just basically means little arteries. Now, these vessels have a thick middle tissue called the tunica media. And this is made of a muscular tissue, which is really important to allow this to stretch and accommodate for the high pressure of the blood that is being pushed through this tiny tube. So this is where the blood goes immediately after that left ventricle shoves it out into the body. And our heart pumps incredibly hard and that blood comes out very quickly. So we need to have those thick walls to be able to withstand this constant pressure of every beat of the heart as it pushes the blood into the arteries here. So they need to be able to withstand all that pressure. So as a result, these are also where we take our blood pressure from. Because they're under so much pressure, you can actually feel a pulse in them as every time the heart beats, they kind of stretch a little bit to accommodate that sudden pressure surge. So when you take your blood pressure, you're measuring it from your arteries. Now, because they're also under pressure, if an artery is cut, you end up with what's called a spurting bleed. It's not just going to dribble out of your body, it's going to be propelled out with a lot of pressure, which is kind of gross. Veins, on the other hand, are the opposite side. So once all of the blood has taken the oxygen to all of our tissues, it now has to make its way back to the heart. So the veins carry deoxygenated blood. And they don't have these elastic layers that the arteries have because it's not really under that much pressure anymore. And because there's not high pressure driving that blood in the same direction forward through our body, the veins actually have their own, if you look right here, they have their own valves. And this prevents the blood from accidentally flowing backwards. We want it to keep going forward back to the heart. But because there's so little pressure, it can't do that. So these valves close in between every heartbeat to prevent it from flowing backward. Now, These are our slow bleeds, so when we cut these, they'll just kind of dribble out blood because they're not pressurized. Now with these ones, the larger ones are called veins, and the smaller they get, they're called venules. So when we're looking at this whole process, you start in the heart, you go out of the aortic, or the aorta, excuse me, that's our largest artery, and it travels through all your other major arteries and then goes down to your arterioles, then to the capillaries, drops off its oxygen, picks up CO2, and then from those capillaries, they move into venules, then veins, then from the vena cava back up to the heart, and then sent out to the lungs to pick up oxygen. So here's just a list of all those major arteries. You might have heard of some of these, like the aorta, the coronary arteries, the subclavian, that's underneath your clavicle in your shoulder, the brachial in your arm, the femoral in your leg, all that kind of stuff. These are the ones where if you cut them, it's either immediate death or very, very early death if you don't get help right away. And here's just a list of your major veins as well: the vena cava, the jugular, the subclavian and brachial. You probably have heard of a lot of these. So the way that our cardiovascular system works, you probably have picked up on it as I've repeated it a bunch of times, but we have double loop circulation. We loop oxygenated blood through the body, pick up or deoxygenate it back to the heart. Then the heart has to send it through the lungs and then back out into the body. So we have this pulmonary circuit where the heart sends deoxygenated blood, which is often shown as blue because of the iron in our blood. When the iron picks up oxygen, it actually technically rusts and turns that beautiful red color. When it is not oxygenated, it often appears bluish in color. So that's why we depict them with these colors. So the deoxygenated blood goes out from the heart to the lungs. The lungs fill it with all this oxygen, and then they have to send it back to the heart. The heart then has to take all of that oxygenated blood and send it out to the body. But once the body uses up all the oxygen, it has to come back to the heart. So we have the lung circuit called the pulmonary circuit, and we have the body circuit called the systemic circuit, where we're sending it to all the systems of the body. So the pulmonary circuit carries blood from the heart to the lungs, picks up oxygen, releases the CO2. The systemic circuit carries the blood from the heart to the body and then back up to the heart, drops off oxygen, picks up CO2. So they basically just do the opposite of each other. So the direction of blood flow is that the left side of the heart takes in the oxygenated blood, sends it out, pumps blood out through the aorta to the tissues, and then that the right side receives the deoxygenated blood. And the septum keeps the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood from mixing. So this is just a step-by-step if you need to see it. Where is it tracking the entire time as you move through the heart and the body? So here is just some images. Sorry, I meant for all these to show up right away. Just so you can see the different structures and have them pointed out all on one image here. Now, let's talk about blood before we jump into our respiratory system discussion. So blood is a fluid tissue. It functions to transport oxygen, nutrients, and hormones throughout the body, and it travels in our arteries and our veins. It is the only fluid tissue that humans have. Obviously, we produce fluid in the form of like saliva and urine, but that's not a tissue. That's just liquid that we produce. It's waste product. Whereas blood, it actually contains cells that are important for us to live. In the average human, there's about 1.2 to 1.5 gallons of blood. It's about 7% of your total body weight. Newborns only have 270 milliliters. That's 0.07 gallons. So we go from 0.07 gallons to 1.2 to 1.5. So as a result, newborns and little babies, they have a much harder time regulating their water content in their blood. So dehydration in kids and babies is a much bigger problem than it is in adults. So we call shock the thing that happens when you lose that volume of your blood supply, particularly water supply in your blood. In plants, they have blood too, they just call it sap, and it's just a little bit different than ours. So the blood has to be able to get to all parts of your body. If it can't, it has to have some kind of way of those cells delivering the nutrients to other cells nearby. Otherwise, you have to think of it as those capillaries have to cover every single cell that needs oxygen, which is every single cell in our body. So that's why blood goes everywhere. And it contains cells of not only red blood cells that carry the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, but it contains our immune system as well, because it makes sense that our immune system also needs to be able to access every part of our body. And it's transported by the cardiovascular system, and we're going to go over this now, but it has many liquid and cell components. So let's talk about that composition, that makeup of the blood. So whenever you see blood in this kind of structure or breakdown, what's happened is the blood has been centrifuged. So it's put in this giant, or I guess not too big, but it's put in this big machine and it's spun at incredibly fast speeds so that everything heavy falls down to the bottom of the tube and all the lighter stuff stays up at the top. As a result, we get 3 layers in our blood. We get the plasma, the buffy coat, or the white blood cells and platelets. This is just a medical term in case you're interested in that kind of stuff. And then our red blood cell mass. So the plasma is the biggest portion of our blood. This is the liquid component. It contains the oxygen, the salts, the dissolved nutrients, the dissolved carbon dioxide, the dissolved waste, all of that important stuff. It includes our antibodies, dissolved proteins. So this is where a lot of that stuff dissolves into when we talk about our blood. It's 90% water though. So as you can see, that dehydration factor is really big when you're talking about something that is most of our blood and most of that is water. Now, the less plasma you have from dehydration or blood loss means your blood is going to get thicker. There's going to be more cells and less liquid, so it's going to have a harder time flowing. That means your heart has to pump harder. That increases your blood pressure, and it can just cause problems down the road. So living in a constant state of dehydration makes your blood work harder, which actually kind of gives you less life, because as the heart works harder, it's going to wear out sooner. Then the other 45% of our blood is our red blood cells and our white blood cells. So the red blood cells have the iron, the hemoglobin in them that attaches to the oxygen and carries the oxygen around. It also collects all the CO2. And then the white blood cells are our immune cells. They go around and they eat bacteria, dead cells, any debris. They can recognize diseases and they can fight them for us. So let's move on to the respiratory system. So the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system function very closely to each other. Basically, one of them takes care of how our body interfaces with the environment, and the other one then takes care of the body. So the cardiovascular system takes what the respiratory system brings in and does something with it. So the respiratory system itself, its job is to bring oxygen into the body and remove carbon dioxide waste. So the major structures are our nose and mouth, obviously, our pharynx and our larynx and the soft palates in our mouth and throat, the trachea, the diaphragm, the bronchioles, the lungs, the alveoli. So we have a lot of parts when it comes to our respiratory system, but we're only going to go over a few. So the way that our lungs work is because of a strong, large muscle called the diaphragm. This is going to span across your entire chest, your thoracic cavity. And you can see it here. It attaches onto your lungs, excuse me. It does attach to your lungs, but it also attaches to your ribs in your chest. When it contracts, because muscles just, all they can do is contract and then relax. So a contraction is when the muscle gets smaller or shorter. So as this muscle contracts, it's going to pull itself down, and it's going to pull everything that it's attached to, your heart, your lungs, all that. It's going to pull them down slightly. When this happens to your lungs, as they get pulled down, there's now more space, more volume inside the lung itself. And whatever air is in there now has more space to fit in, and it actually creates a partial vacuum. So as your diaphragm contracts and pulls down, you get a vacuum in your lungs, and the result is that air from the atmosphere gets sucked into your lungs. I know it feels like when you're breathing, you're kind of forcing it in, but actually the air will rush in normally because you've created that partial vacuum. So this is called inspiration, breathing in. And then when you want to breathe out or exhale, your diaphragm just relaxes. It no longer contracts and pulls down. As it relaxes, it will push up on your lungs, making that volume smaller and smaller, and it will force air out of your lungs into the environment when you exhale. Now, from our mouth down, our lung is made up of smaller and smaller branches. It kind of looks like an upside down tree. So at first, I'm sorry about that. So first, the air enters in through our noses. We should be nasal breathing. The mouth is more for eating than it is for breathing. We just also are able to breathe through our mouth. It's much better for our overall health if we breathe through our nose, because our nose is better at filtering out viral particles and bacteria and molds and all of that, whereas it's not as efficient if we do that through our mouth. We also warm the air a lot better and humidify it as we breathe through our nose, so it doesn't dry out our lungs as much, and that helps us be healthier as well. So nasal breathing is incredibly important. That's why there's that term that's kind of derogatory of calling someone a mouth breather. Usually it means, they have something wrong with their ability to breathe in through their nose, and it affects their ability to be healthy by breathing always through your mouth. So air enters through our nose, goes down into the trachea, which is this gigantic structure that looks like the big trunk of the tree. That branches off into what we call the bronchioles, the bronchi. The bronchi then go down into smaller and smaller bronchioles, and the bronchioles end in these grape-like sacs of tissue called alveoli. The alveoli are literally just air sacs, and these air sacs are completely surrounded by capillaries. So the capillaries actually touch the surface of the alveoli. And this is incredibly important because this is how we transfer oxygen and CO2 between our blood and our lungs. So the walls of the alveoli and the capillaries are actually only one cell thick. That's very rare for things in our bodies because that means they're quite fragile. But this is important at this very specific point because it allows easy transfer of the oxygen and the CO2 across that barrier. If this was many, many cells thick, it would be a very arduous, energy-demanding process to get the oxygen out of the lungs and the CO2 in. So what happens is When you breathe in, all of your alveoli get filled with oxygen gas. The oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen, meaning the amount of oxygen in your lungs, is higher than the amount of oxygen in your veins. Because remember, the veins carry all that deoxygenated blood. The cells used up all the oxygen, so there's no oxygen left. So naturally in this world, we'll talk about this in a couple weeks, but naturally things like to move from an area of a high amount to a low amount until they're equal everywhere. It's called diffusion. So the high amount of oxygen is going to want to move over into the low amount of oxygen area. So the air goes from the lungs into the capillaries, from the alveoli across those two layers into the blood. Now, the opposite is also true. This blood also contains very high levels of CO2. It's a waste product from our cells. So our cells make all this CO2, give it to the blood and say, take this away, I don't want it, man. But once we've breathed in, we have very low levels of CO2 in our alveoli. So the high levels of CO2 in our blood naturally move over towards the low levels of CO2 in our alveoli. Now, what basically just happened is when I breathed in and filled my lungs with oxygen, that oxygen is forced into my blood. The CO2 then offloads into my lungs and fills my lungs with CO2. And when I breathe it out, I'm releasing all that CO2 that just got put in there. So that is it for this particular topic. In class, we're going to go over some of the fun, problems of when our cardiovascular system and respiratory system fail. What are some of the diseases and the trauma that can happen and ways that we fix these problems. And then we'll also talk about connecting this back to the chemistry of life. We're going to very specifically discuss buffers and how our blood acts as a buffer to prevent too much acidity or too much alkalinity or basic environment from developing in our bodies. So if you have any questions, just let me know.